What if I told you that at the same time the Earps were walking the streets of Tombstone, there lived and walked a doctor whose story is even more fascinating than that of the Earps? And no, it's not Doc Holliday. In a town best known for a 30-second gunfight, the subject of countless books, movies, television shows, you gotta be wondering, well, what could be bigger than that? Stick around and find out. Tombstone, Arizona. For Old West history buffs, those two words paint quite a picture, don't they? Visions of Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, the notorious cowboy gang, and of course, of a certain incident that started in a vacant lot behind the OK Corral and then spilled out into the street and in the history. And believe me, I get it. The man I'm talking about was a gun-toting, knife-wielding, hard-drinking gambler and sporting man. And of all the colorful characters that populated our Old West, I have found none to be more interesting than this guy. And no, it's not Doc Holliday. Okay then, if not Doc Holliday, then who am I talking about? And what would have made this guy stand out from amongst the plethora of all the other interesting characters who lived here at the time? Well, what if I was to tell you that in addition to everything else, he was a geologist, a mining engineer, a competitive boxer, an inventor, a scientist, and a surgeon? Curious? Howdy, I'm Dr. J, and this here is Boots. Sadly, our history is going away, and our mission is to rescue as much of it as possible before it's all gone for good. So what do you say, Boots? You want to find out more about that famous doctor that roamed the streets of Tombstone? Come on, let's go. Meet Dr. George Emery Goodfellow, friend to high-ranking politicians and the Earps and Doc Holliday and the Cowboys. Equally at home in a saloon, on a posse, in a boxing ring, or in an operating room. Equally adept with six-gun and scalpel. So, really, who was this guy? And how the heck did he end up here in Tombstone, Arizona, of all places? Well, George grew up in Northern California, the son of a mining engineer. And early on, he developed an interest in mining, geology, and medicine. 3 interests that would follow him for the rest of his life. As such, George applied to and was accepted by Worcester University Medical College in Cleveland, Ohio, where he excelled, especially in surgery. Now, here's a fun fact, and something that's actually a little bit scary. Back then, most medical doctors had never even attended medical school, and if they did, it would have just been a 3-year program straight out of high school. Following graduation, George heard rumors of a big strike in a place called Tombstone, Arizona territory. So, off he went. Upon his arrival, however, even though the town was still in its infancy, George was simply astonished to find that there were no less than 12 other doctors already in place. Only 3 of which, by the way, had an actual license to practice medicine. Nevertheless, George and his new wife, Kate, more about her in a moment, quickly assimilated themselves into the business and social fabrics of the town. His strong personality, and I do mean strong, along with various relationships he had formed along the way with some very powerful people, including Virgil Earp, served him well, to say the least. In the Old West, the practice of medicine was often just that. Impromptu surgeries would break out right there at the scene of the incident, with the unfortunate patient either sprawled over a whiskey barrel or maybe even laid out on a billiard table. Oh yes, and you can forget all about such niceties as anesthesia and infection control. Speaking of which, get this. Of the 600,000 men who perished during our Civil War, fully 400,000 of them died not just from bullet wounds, but from infection of all sorts. Sadly, the advent of something as simple as penicillin was still years away. On the contrary, Dr. Goodfellow's unquenchable thirst for knowledge in all disciplines made him one of the first physicians anywhere to actually embrace the concepts of anesthesia and infection control. Within 9 short months of his arrival in Tombstone, Dr. Goodfellow had already climbed to the top of the heap. His vast knowledge of mine engineering and geology made him an absolute shoo-in for the position of physician of record for most of the mining operations here in town. In addition, in 1881, Dr. Goodfellow was part of a project in which a 23-mile pipeline was built from the Huachuca Mountains, way over there, all the way to Tombstone, making this here municipality one of the first in the region, mind you, to actually have running water. He was also involved in the construction of Arizona Territory's very first municipal swimming pool, which, by the way, still exists as one of the oldest public swimming pools in all of North America. A little while ago, I mentioned Dr. Goodfellow's wife. Catherine Colt, it turns out, was cousin to Samuel Colt, inventor of the Colt revolver, the effects of which would later play a huge role in the development of Dr. Goodfellow's surgical skills. Speaking of which, back then, being gut shot would have been an automatic death sentence. Why? Because no doctor anywhere would have been willing to perform surgery below the belt line. I mean, that's an anatomical no man's land. Living as he was, however, in a town where being gut shot might actually be a relatively common experience, Dr. Goodfellow figured that, well, since his patient was a goner anyway, why not, like Captain Kirk on Star Trek, boldly go where no man has gone before? result? Dr. Goodfellow is considered to be the father of abdominal surgery, as well as America's very first civilian trauma surgeon. Now, as his reputation as a miracle worker spread far and wide, get this, he was even put on retainer, mind you, by men who might from time to time find themselves on the wrong end of a gun and at some future time be in need of his particular services. Hence his nickname, the gunfighter surgeon. Aside from his surgical skills that were considerable, Dr. Goodfellow had always considered himself to be a sporting man. For example, when not seeing patients in his offices, up here over the Crystal Palace Saloon, he could often be found here, downstairs at the bar. And did I happen to mention that aside from being a heavy drinker, he had a bit of a temper? Yeah, it seems that on numerous occasions, the man whose life he was attempting to save was someone that he had just shot or stabbed, no doubt over some trivial gambling dispute. Now, that's not to say he didn't have a sense of humor, however. Having just been present at a lynching where a convicted criminal was strung up from a telegraph pole, Dr. Goodfellow was faced with a bit of a dilemma. You see, there he was, county coroner, paid county official, as well as a doctor who had at one time taken an oath to do no harm, not only present at a lynching, taking part in it as well. The solution? A darkly humorous explanation that without a doubt has to be the most unusual coroner's report ever written. He ruled, and I quote, "The deceased died from emphysema of the lungs, commonly occurring at higher altitudes." That may or may not have been brought on by strangulation, self-inflicted or otherwise. His dry sense of humor aside, if nothing else, Dr. Goodfellow was a man of action. On one occasion, having heard that his best friend, Dr. John Handy, had just been gut shot in Tucson, off Dr. Goodfellow went, hell-bent for leather, to Fairbank, about 12 miles away, where he then commandeered, mind you, a steam locomotive and then engineered it himself all the way to Tucson, breaking every previous speed record along the way. Now, he didn't get there in time to save his friend, but his actions that day became a railroading legend. As such, from that day forward, when Dr. Goodfellow was a passenger on a train, he would of course be invited to take over operations of the locomotive. Now, Dr. Goodfellow is MacGyver. Where and how this man learned how to operate a steam locomotive is anybody's guess. As for his scientific curiosity, having performed and assisted in many an autopsy, Dr. Goodfellow found it just a little bit odd that on several occasions, the bullet, although fatal, had for some reason failed to penetrate, of all things, a silk neckerchief, carrying it deep into the wound. He found this unusual enough that it prompted him to write and publish a scientific article entitled "The Impenetrability of Silk to Bullets." Now, that article was noticed by a priest in Chicago who shared Dr. Goodfellow's interest in medicine and decided to give it a shot. Well, this culminated in a most dangerous experiment in which a volunteer wearing a specially woven multiple-layer silk vest, agreed to be shot at close range with a pistol. Do not, I repeat, do not try this at home. Why, you ask? Well, because modern ammunition can penetrate an engine block. Don't do it. The experiment was a resounding success, and now Dr. Goodfellow can be said to have had a hand in the invention of the bulletproof vest. When a strong earthquake struck northern Mexico in 1887, Dr. Goodfellow, who was fluent in Spanish, of course he was, decided to head south of the border to see if he could lend a hand. And boy, did he ever. So many lives were saved that, in fact, the then president of Mexico rewarded him with a prize stallion and a medal that had once been worn by Maximilian. Now, to top things off, grateful Mexicans whose life had been saved by Dr. Goodfellow decided to saint him. And for years following the earthquake, large groups of devout Mexicans would make the long pilgrimage to wherever Dr. Goodfellow was at the moment, just to worship him. Dr. Goodfellow's scientific curiosity, of course, combined with his lifelong interest in geology, prompted him to return to Mexico many more times to further document and diagram the rupture lines from that earthquake. Turns out, this is the first time in history that anyone had thought to do so. Praised by scientists the world over, those diagrams currently reside in the Smithsonian. Dr. Goodfellow's powerful political connections resulted in his being summoned, along with Teddy Roosevelt, who, by the way, he likely knew, why not, to Cuba during the Spanish-American War. Now, like many of us, as we prepare to go on a cruise, Dr. Goodfellow decided to pack light. It seems that a suitcase filled with whiskey bottles was all that he required. And it's said that upon his arrival in Cuba, such heavy libations were applied to a high-ranking Spanish general during the sensitive peace negotiations that it resulted in the signing of documents that led to the end of the Spanish-American War. Now Dr. Goodfellow is Forrest Gump. After years of speculation in mining claims and ranch land, Dr. Goodfellow was finally able to semi-retire to San Francisco, a very wealthy man. And it was there that he decided to invest all of his money in real estate. Now, unfortunately for him, however, on the morning of April 18th, 1906, he awoke in his room at the St. Francis Hotel and looked out the window only to find that the entire city, along with everything he had worked for all of his life, had been destroyed by yet another, this time even more powerful, earthquake. In one fell swoop, the Goodfellows had lost literally everything: home, office, income, investments, patient records, and personal notes. His life and legacy in ruins. We may never know the full extent to which this man continues to impact our lives to this very day. Yet another mystery of history. Dr. Goodfellow was born on December 23rd, 1855, and he died on December 7th, 1910. Now, of much greater importance than those two dates is what all went on in between those two dates. You see, here we have a geologist, a mining engineer, a competitive boxer, and a scientist, an entrepreneur, a sporting man, an inventor, and a groundbreaking surgeon. Friend to lawman and outlaw, here is a man whose scientific curiosity led to so many firsts. As the acknowledged father of abdominal surgery, Dr. Goodfellow was even the first surgeon in Arizona history to perform an appendectomy. And there's so much more, because even today, he's considered to be a pioneer in spinal anesthesia, plastic surgery, and prostate surgery. In his quest to truly understand the way things work, he even allowed himself to be bitten by a Gila monster just to document the effects. And don't forget, it was his observational skills that ultimately led to the invention of the bulletproof vest. Now, believe it or not, there is even more. Here's a guy that rode his horse 700 miles in the Sierra Madre Mountains of Mexico just to further document and diagram the fallout from a major earthquake. And by the way, he did that in just 30 days. To learn more about this amazing pioneer, as well as his contributions to the world, be sure and pick up a copy of the book, Dr. George Goodfellow, Physician to the Gunfighters. Dr. George Emery Goodfellow, a resourceful man who, not unlike MacGyver, could make up solutions to complex problems on the fly, and a man not unlike Forrest Gump, who often found himself in places where history was being made because he was the one making it. Wow, Boots, that was quite a story, wasn't it? Oh, and that reminds me, Boots here wanted to remind you that when you're ready, stop by your local shelter and rescue a little buddy of your very own. What do you say, Boots? Let's keep walking.
You've been walking the American West with Dr. J. Please remember to like and subscribe. And thanks for walking with us.